In the heart of a brutal Montana snowstorm, a tiny golden pup is abandoned, left to face the freezing cold alone. But fate had other plans. When Jake, a grieving widower, discovers the helpless puppy, neither of them could know how their lives would change forever. What makes this bond so powerful? And how does this little pup transform one man's broken world? Montana was engulfed in a brutal snowstorm. The wind howled relentlessly, pushing sheets of snow through the valleys and blanketing every corner of the wilderness. Jake Carter, 35 years old, lived in a modest cabin tucked deep within a forest of towering pines. The cabin was his refuge, a solitary haven since the tragic loss of his wife and unborn child years ago. Jake stood outside, gripping an axe in his calloused hands as he chopped firewood to keep the cabin's hearth alive. Despite the warmth of the fire, the icy chill of the storm seeped into his bones, much like the loneliness that had become a permanent fixture in his life. He was about to head back inside when a faint sound pierced through the howling wind, a weak, plaintive cry, almost drowned out by the storm. Jake froze, tilting his head to listen. The sound came again, more distinct this time, like the whimper of a small creature. His brows furrowed as he scanned the shadowy tree line. Common sense urged him to ignore it, to retreat into the safety of his cabin. But something tugged at him, a distant buried instinct to care. Shrugging on his thick coat, he ventured out into the storm, letting the cry guide him. Jake trudged through the snow, his boots crunching with every step. His breath puffed into the frigid air, mingling with the relentless wind. The cries grew louder, pulling him toward a large pine tree heavily laden with snow. Beneath its drooping branches, he spotted a small trembling figure. His chest tightened at the sight. It was a puppy, a young golden retriever, no more than 5 months old. Its golden fur was matted with snow, and its round, sorrowful eyes looked up at him, pleading for help. The puppy shivered uncontrollably, its floppy ears drooping in despair. Nearby lay a torn collar, as if hastily discarded, a telltale sign of abandonment. Who could be so heartless? Jake muttered, a flicker of anger mingling with his pity. He hesitated, glancing back toward the safety of his cabin. Part of him wanted to walk away, to avoid the responsibility of caring for another life. But those eyes, they seemed to mirror the pain and loneliness he had carried for so long. Letting out a heavy sigh, he knelt down and carefully wrapped the puppy in his coat. "All right, little guy, let's get you out of here," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. Jake hurried back to the cabin, shielding the tiny pup from the biting wind. Inside, he set the puppy down on a thick rug near the fireplace and began brushing the snow off its fur with a towel. The pup still shivered, its body stiff from the cold. Jake poured some warm water into a bowl and placed it nearby, but the puppy didn't move. It was more than cold, it was utterly exhausted. "You need something to eat," Jake said, rummaging through his small pantry. He soaked some dried meat in warm water to soften it and placed it in front of the pup. This time, the little dog's eyes lit up and it slowly stretched its neck to take a bite. Jake sat down nearby, watching as the puppy ate with a hunger that spoke of days without food. "Good boy," Jake murmured. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The puppy paused mid-bite, looking up at him with eyes filled with gratitude. Jake felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years. As the evening wore on, Jake made a small bed for the puppy near the hearth. After hours of rest and warmth, the puppy began to stir, wagging its short tail tentatively as it explored the cabin. Despite its recent ordeal, the pup's playful curiosity emerged, bringing a rare smile to Jake's face. "You need a name," Jake said, crouching down to look at the little dog. "How about Buddy? That suits a guy like you, doesn't it?" The puppy tilted its head, one ear flopping to the side, as if considering the suggestion. When Jake repeated the name, "Buddy," the pup responded with a cheerful wag of its tail, a silent agreement. Jake chuckled, feeling a faint glimmer of joy that he hadn't experienced in years. That night, as Jake sat in his old armchair, he watched Buddy curled up by the fireplace, its small body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. The storm raged on outside, but inside, there was a quiet warmth that Jake hadn't known since his loss. His cabin, once a hollow refuge, now felt like a home again. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Buddy," he said softly. The puppy opened its eyes and looked at him, trust and love shining in its gaze. Jake nodded slowly. "We're going to be okay, you and me." The storm outside screamed into the night, but within the cabin walls, a tiny spark of hope had been kindled. For the first time in years, Jake felt the weight of his grief begin to lift, replaced by the comforting presence of a small, golden companion. The first rays of dawn broke through the dense winter clouds, casting a pale light over Jake's cabin. Inside, the warm glow of the fireplace illuminated a new reality for Jake Carter. He had spent years in silence, with only the occasional creak of the wooden floor or the howling wind to keep him company. But now, his home was alive with movement and mischief. Buddy, still young and full of energy, was exploring every corner of the cabin like it was his personal kingdom. His fluffy golden fur seemed to catch the light, and his tail wagged with such enthusiasm that it knocked over a stack of books Jake had left on the coffee table. "Buddy, no," Jake said, his voice a mix of annoyance and disbelief as he rushed to pick up the scattered books. The puppy looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes, tilting his head as if to say, "What did I do?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're a handful, you know that?" Buddy barked in response, a high-pitched yip that echoed through the cabin. He then bounded toward Jake, his tail wagging furiously, and began pawing at his legs. Jake couldn't help but chuckle at the puppy's unrelenting cheerfulness. Despite the chaos, Buddy's presence was oddly comforting. As the days went on, Jake realized that Buddy wasn't just energetic, he was clingy. Wherever Jake went, Buddy followed. If Jake was chopping wood outside, Buddy would sit by the door, barking if he couldn't see him. If Jake tried to read by the fire, Buddy would nudge his hand until he put the book down and gave him attention. One evening, Jake tried to focus on repairing a loose chair leg. Buddy, determined not to be ignored, trotted over and plopped down right in front of him, blocking his view. "Buddy, I need to work," Jake said, exasperated. Buddy tilted his head, then licked Jake's hand before resting his chin on Jake's knee. Jake sighed deeply, his frustration melting away. "You're impossible," he muttered, scratching behind Buddy's ears. The puppy closed his eyes, letting out a contented sigh. Buddy's antics didn't stop there. He seemed to have a knack for getting into trouble. One morning, Jake returned from fetching firewood to find Buddy gleefully chewing on one of his old boots. "Buddy!" Jake exclaimed, pulling the boot away. Buddy responded by grabbing a loose sock and sprinting across the room, his tail wagging like a flag. Jake chased after him, laughing despite himself. "Fine, you win," Jake said, collapsing onto the couch while Buddy jumped up beside him, proudly holding the sock like a trophy. Jake looked at the mischievous puppy and shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're going to be the end of me." But as much as Buddy drove Jake crazy, the laughter and life he brought to the cabin were undeniable. For the first time in years, Jake felt something stir within him, a spark of joy he hadn't known he was missing. One snowy evening, as the wind howled outside, Jake sat by the fire with Buddy curled up at his feet. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional snore from Buddy. Jake found himself staring into the flames, lost in thought. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to feel anything beyond numbness. The weight of his grief had been his constant companion, a barrier between him and the world. But now, as Buddy snuggled closer, Jake realized that the walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crack. Buddy stirred, yawning and stretching before looking up at Jake with his warm, trusting eyes. Jake reached down and stroked the puppy's soft fur. "You're not just a handful, are you?" he said quietly. "You're something else entirely." Buddy wagged his tail in response, thumping it against the rug. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'm talking to a dog now." "Great." But in that moment, Jake didn't feel foolish. For the first time in a long time, he felt connected. Not just to Buddy, but to something greater. Over the next few days, Jake began to notice subtle changes in himself. He found that he didn't mind the noise Buddy brought into his once silent home. The messes, the demands for attention, the endless energy, it all seemed to remind him that life, no matter how chaotic, was worth living. One morning, as Jake watched Buddy chase a snowflake through the cabin window, he realized he hadn't thought about his grief in hours. It was still there, like a shadow, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. Somehow, Buddy had managed to lighten the load. The wind howled with an unrelenting fury, shaking the wooden cabin as if testing its strength against nature's wrath. Snow whipped against the windows in thick blinding flurries, forming icy barricades along the sills. Inside the small cabin was a stark contrast, a cocoon of warmth and flickering light from the fireplace. But the storm outside seemed to seep into Jake Carter's thoughts, stirring a tempest of memories he had long tried to bury. Buddy lay curled up near the hearth, his golden fur shimmering in the firelight. He gnawed idly on a piece of kindling, blissfully unaware of the chaos raging beyond the cabin walls. Jake sat nearby in his worn armchair, staring at the flames as they danced, his mind far away. The hours dragged on, marked only by the occasional pop of the firewood and the ceaseless roar of the wind. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he watched Buddy. The puppy's small frame, so full of life, was a stark reminder of the fragility and resilience of living things. "You don't care about the storm, do you?" Jake muttered, his voice soft. Buddy's ears perked up and he lifted his head, tilting it in that familiar curious way. Jake chuckled faintly. "No, you're just happy to be here, aren't you?" Buddy wagged his tail, thumping it against the rug as if to say, "Of course I am." Jake reached down and scratched behind Buddy's ears. The warmth of the little dog's presence began to melt the icy weight in Jake's chest. For years, he had endured storms, both external and internal, alone. Now for the first time, he didn't feel entirely abandoned in their midst. As the storm outside intensified, Jake found himself speaking, his voice filling the quiet space between them. At first, it was small, idle comments. How he'd built the cabin years ago, the places he used to explore in the surrounding woods. But gradually, the words began to take on weight, each one pulling him closer to memories he had locked away. "You know, Buddy," Jake said, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames, "this isn't the life I thought I'd have. I used to think I had it all figured out." Buddy stretched, then rested his head on Jake's knee, gazing up at him with trusting eyes. It was an invitation Jake didn't know he needed. He took a deep breath, letting the words spill out. There was someone. Her name was Sarah. She was everything. Jake's voice faltered, and he blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. She had this way of lighting up a room, you know? She'd laugh, and suddenly everything felt warmer, brighter. Buddy let out a soft whine, his tail wagging slightly as if encouraging Jake to continue. Jake smiled faintly, reaching down to stroke Buddy's fur. "We were going to have a family," Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But life doesn't always go the way you plan. There was an accident. I couldn't save her, Buddy. I couldn't save either of them." The weight of his grief settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Jake closed his eyes, his hand trembling as it rested on Buddy's head. The puppy nuzzled against him, his warmth and presence offering a quiet solace that words could never provide. Time seemed to blur as Jake sat there, lost in the memories he had avoided for so long. Buddy remained by his side, his unwavering loyalty a balm for Jake's aching heart. Each time Jake's voice broke or his shoulders sagged under the weight of his emotions, Buddy would nuzzle closer, his soft fur absorbing Jake's silent tears. "You're a good listener, you know that?" Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Buddy responded with a quiet bark, his tail wagging gently. Jake laughed, the sound surprising him. It was small, fleeting, but it was real. For the first time in years, the laughter didn't feel forced or hollow. It felt natural. "You're more than a dog, Buddy," Jake said, scratching under Buddy's chin. You're what I needed. Even if I didn't know it." The storm raged on through the night, but inside the cabin, there was a peace that hadn't existed before. Jake and Buddy sat together by the fire, their bond solidified by the shared warmth of companionship. The crackling flames cast shadows on the walls, but the darkness no longer felt so oppressive. Instead, it felt intimate, a space where grief could coexist with healing. Jake leaned back in his chair, his eyes growing heavy. Buddy shifted, curling up at his feet, his small body radiating a comforting warmth. As sleep began to claim him, Jake murmured, "Thanks, Buddy, for sticking around." When Jake woke, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, illuminating the cabin in a soft golden glow. Buddy was already awake, wagging his tail enthusiastically as Jake stirred. Jake stretched, feeling a sense of lightness he hadn't felt in years. The storm had left the world outside blanketed in pristine snow, but inside, it had done something even greater. It had cracked open the walls Jake had built around his heart, allowing warmth and hope to seep back in. As Jake looked at Buddy, bounding around the room with boundless energy, he smiled. "Let's go see what the world looks like today, huh?" he said. Buddy barked, racing to the door, ready for whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt ready too. The storm had calmed, its once ferocious winds reduced to an icy whisper. Snow still blanketed the world outside, a thick heavy quilt that seemed to swallow all sound. Jake stood by the cabin door, axe in hand, staring out at the unforgiving landscape. The fire inside the cabin was dwindling, and with it their source of warmth. "We need more wood, Buddy," Jake muttered, glancing down at the golden puppy sitting faithfully by his side. Buddy wagged his tail, oblivious to the danger that still lurked in the cold. "Stay here, I'll be quick." Buddy whined softly as Jake stepped out, closing the door behind him. The puppy scratched at the wood, his instincts telling him to follow, but he stayed put, trusting Jake's command. The cold bit at Jake's face as he trudged through the snow toward the woodpile, the axe heavy in his gloved hand. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and every step felt like a battle against the unyielding snow. He worked quickly, chopping logs and stacking them in a bundle. The storm had left the woodpile frozen, and Jake had to strike harder than usual to break through the ice. As he raised the axe for another swing, his foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. He fell hard, the axe clattering from his hands as a sharp, searing pain shot through his leg. Jake groaned, clutching his knee, and tried to stand, but the pain was too much. His breath quickened as he realized the gravity of the situation. The cold seeped through his clothes and he could feel his body growing weaker by the minute. "Damn it," Jake hissed, his voice barely audible over the wind. The cabin was too far to crawl back, and his injured leg throbbed with every attempt to move. He lay there, helpless, the cold tightening its grip on him. Inside the cabin, Buddy paced anxiously by the door. Something was wrong. He could feel it. He whined, pawing at the door, his ears perked as if listening for a sound that wasn't there. Finally, unable to wait any longer, Buddy sprang into action. He nosed the door open, his small frame slipping into the icy world outside. The puppy's golden coat stood out against the stark white snow as he followed Jake's scent. The cold nipped at his nose and paws, but he pressed on, his determination unwavering. When Buddy reached the woodpile and saw Jake lying in the snow, he barked loudly, running circles around him. "Buddy?" Jake murmured, his voice weak. Relief washed over him as he saw the puppy's familiar face, but it was quickly replaced by dread. You need to go back, Buddy. It's not safe." Buddy ignored him, his tail wagging furiously as he assessed the situation. He sniffed at Jake's leg, then looked around. His sharp puppy eyes searching for something, or someone that could help. Buddy made a decision. With one last bark, he turned and sprinted into the distance. Jake watched in disbelief as the puppy disappeared into the snow. "Buddy, no," he whispered, his heart sinking. But Buddy wasn't abandoning him. He was on a mission. The closest neighbor, Earl, lived 2 miles away, a grueling distance for a small puppy in freezing temperatures. But Buddy didn't hesitate. He bounded through the deep snow, his small paws sinking with every step, but his determination never wavered. The icy wind whipped at his face, and his breath came in short, visible bursts, but he pressed on. Every now and then, Buddy paused, sniffing the air to ensure he was on the right path. He remembered the faint scent of Earl's farm, a place he had visited briefly when Jake first found him. The journey was treacherous, but Buddy's instincts and unwavering loyalty propelled him forward. Earl was sitting by his own fireplace, sipping on a cup of coffee, when he heard the frantic barking outside. Frowning, he stood and walked to the door, opening it to find Buddy, covered in snow, barking and jumping with urgency. "What in the world?" Earl muttered, recognizing Jake's puppy. "What are you doing out here, boy?" Buddy barked again, turning in circles before running a few steps and looking back at Earl, as if to say, "Follow me." Earl grabbed his coat and boots, quickly realizing that something was wrong. "All right, I'm coming," he said, grabbing a flashlight and a first aid kit. Buddy led the way, bounding through the snow with renewed energy now that he had help. When they reached Jake, Earl knelt beside him, assessing the situation. Jake's face was pale, his lips slightly blue from the cold. "You've got one hell of a dog, Jake," Earl said as he began to check the injured leg. "He came all the way to my place to get me." Jake managed a weak smile, his breath shaky. "Buddy, he's something else, isn't he?" Earl nodded, wrapping Jake in a blanket before helping him onto a makeshift sled he had brought along. With Buddy trotting beside them, they slowly made their way back to Earl's farmhouse, where Jake could recover in safety. Later that evening, Jake lay on a couch in Earl's farmhouse, his leg bandaged and propped up on a pillow. Buddy was curled up beside him, his small body pressed tightly against Jake's side. Earl had insisted Jake stay the night, ensuring he had time to rest and heal. Jake looked down at the puppy, his hand resting on Buddy's soft fur. "You saved my life, Buddy," he said, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. "I don't know how you did it, but thank you." Buddy responded by nuzzling into Jake's chest, his tail thumping softly against the couch. For the first time, Jake truly understood what Buddy meant to him. The puppy wasn't just a companion or a playful distraction. He was a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest, coldest moments, hope could shine through. The snow began to melt in patches, revealing the dormant earth beneath. Streams of water trickled through the forest, fed by the thawing ice, and the air carried the faint, fresh scent of approaching spring. Jake Carter stood outside his cabin, the crisp morning sun warming his face. The harsh winter was over, and with it, something inside him felt lighter. Softer. Buddy darted through the clearing, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. His boundless energy seemed to mirror the renewal of the season. Jake watched him with a smile, his hands resting on his hips. "Looks like spring suits you, Buddy," Jake said, laughing as the puppy leapt into a shallow puddle, splashing water everywhere. Buddy barked in agreement, wagging his tail furiously. The arrival of spring brought with it a sense of opportunity and change. Jake, once content to remain isolated, now found himself drawn to the outside world. Thanks to Buddy, the silence he had once clung to no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a cage he was ready to leave behind. Jake started small. When Earl came by to check on him after the storm, Jake invited him in for coffee, something he hadn't done for anyone in years. They sat at the kitchen table, Buddy lounging at their feet, and talked for hours about the storm, about life, and about the puppy who had saved it. "You're different, Jake," Earl remarked, taking a sip of his coffee. "That dog of yours. He's done something to you." Jake smiled, looking down at Buddy. "Yeah, he has. I didn't know how much I needed him." Encouraged by Earl, Jake began venturing into town. At first, it was just short trips to the local market, where Buddy would charm the shopkeepers with his playful antics. But soon, Jake found himself lingering, engaging in conversations he would have avoided in the past. People were drawn to Buddy's cheerful presence, and through him, Jake found a way to reconnect. One afternoon, while visiting Earl's farm, Jake noticed a flyer tacked to the barn wall. It was an ad for the local animal shelter, asking for volunteers. The word struck a chord in Jake, and he found himself unable to shake the thought. "You think I'd be any good at that?" Jake asked Earl, gesturing to the flyer. Earl raised an eyebrow. "You tell me. Look at what you've done for Buddy." Jake glanced at the golden pup, now chasing a butterfly across the yard. Buddy had been so much more than a rescue. He had been a reminder of what it meant to care, to love, to hope. The following week, Jake walked into the animal shelter for the first time. The space was small but bustling, filled with the sounds of barking dogs and meowing cats. A young woman named Clara, the shelter's manager, greeted him warmly. "You're Jake, right? Earl told me about you. And Buddy," she said with a smile. "We'd love to have you here." Jake nodded, feeling a nervous excitement he hadn't felt in years. I think I'd like to help." Volunteering at the shelter became a turning point for Jake. Each day he spent there felt meaningful, as he helped care for animals who had been abandoned, neglected or lost. He saw echoes of Buddy in every frightened dog and timid cat, and it strengthened his resolve to give them the second chance they deserved. Buddy often accompanied Jake to the shelter, quickly becoming a favorite among the staff and visitors. The golden pup's infectious energy seemed to brighten even the darkest corners of the place. He was a natural at comforting nervous animals, sitting quietly beside them as if to say, "It's going to be okay. I've been there too." One day, a young boy came into the shelter with his mother. The boy was shy and hesitant, hiding behind her leg. Buddy, sensing his unease, trotted over and gently nudged the boy's hand with his nose. The boy giggled, his fear melting away. Jake watched the scene unfold, a lump forming in his throat. "Buddy has a gift," Clara said softly, standing beside him. "And so do you, Jake." As the weeks turned into months, Jake felt himself changing. He was no longer the man who had shut himself away from the world. The community began to see him not as the reclusive widower in the woods, but as the man with the golden dog who brought warmth and hope wherever they went. The shelter thrived with Jake's help, and he found a deep satisfaction in the work. Each animal he helped find a home felt like a small victory, a way of paying forward the gift Buddy had given him. Buddy remained his constant companion through it all. Every night, they would return to the cabin, tired but content, and Buddy would curl up at Jake's feet as he read by the fire. The cabin, once a place of solitude and grief, now felt alive, a true home. By the time summer arrived, Jake and Buddy had become inseparable fixtures in the community. People would stop Jake on the street to ask about Buddy, and Jake, once a man of few words, found himself sharing stories of their adventures. One evening, as Jake stood outside the cabin watching the sunset, Buddy trotted up beside him, carrying a stick in his mouth. Jake took it and tossed it into the field, laughing as Buddy bounded after it. "You've changed everything, Buddy," Jake said aloud. The dog returned with the stick, dropping it at Jake's feet and looking up with bright, trusting eyes. Jake knelt down, ruffling the puppy's golden fur. "Thanks for sticking around, pal." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Buddy had brought him out of the cold, not just of winter, but of his own heart. Together, they had found a new season, a season of hope, connection, and purpose.